Well, as I'm speaking to you now in early March 2014, Syria is still engulfed in a civil war with heavy losses. Russia has just invaded the Crimea region of Ukraine and is poised to invade the entire eastern region of Ukraine. In this context, I wonder if people are thinking, is national sovereignty inherently unlimited? Is it absolute? People who have studied this might think back to Jean Bodin, B-O-D-I-N, in the 16th century, who established this idea of an absolutist notion of sovereignty. And relatively quickly in the next century, Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan, which supported that contention, that national sovereignty, or the sovereignty of a ruler, whether it be an individual king or an assembly, is absolute, at least with respect to other human beings, or even in the earthly realm. Both Bodin and Hobbes stated that the kings, sovereigns, don't have absolute authority, that when in the case of Bodin, he said that divine law and natural law are constraints. Thomas Hobbes, interesting, said, well, divine law during this lifetime is not a constraint on the sovereign, but divine judgment after death is a constraint. So what do we make of this idea of absolute sovereignty, and by implication, the lack of any international force that can offer any sort of constraint on the abuses of the national sovereignties? It's sort of ironic that Russia, along with China, tends to veto proposals in the UN Security Council to constrain the absolute sovereignty of rulers like Assad in Syria, who have turned against their own people. When I say turned against, I mean the unarmed people, the innocents. So what do we make of all this? Has the world progressed at all beyond any kind of medieval or early modern, political arrangements and understandings? We've had all this technological advancement and medical advancement in the last century, the 20th century. It seems kind of funny to say last century. What about, we've also had economic development, these huge corporations, financial instruments, huge massing of private capital, and higher standards of living. Of course, there's been problems with that. But what about political development? What about international relations? Are we essentially still in the Stone Age in that regard? I want to look at Thomas Hobbes here, a few lines that I think are particularly useful for us now. He says the office of this is in his Leviathan, he says the office of the sovereign consists in the end, namely in the procurement of the safety of the people, to which he is obliged by the law of nature, and to render an account thereof to God, the author of that law. So it's either there's some constraint of, say, a ruler in that both the law of nature and divine law. But notice his account given to God is in the afterlife, and he's obliged by the law of nature. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's constrained by the law of nature. In fact, notice that there's a condition on the office of the sovereign. The sovereignty is conditional on procuring the safety of the people. What about when the sovereign, instead of protecting the people, turns on the people? He says further back, all punishments of innocent subjects are against the law of nature, for punishment is only for transgression of the law. This is why it's important that we're talking about innocent subjects, say in Syria, those who have not taken up revolt violence, because you could argue that against the law. Because Hobbes continues, further can arrive no good in the commonwealth by punishing the innocent. For seeing all sovereign power is originally given by the consent of every one of the subjects, so we have a social contract, to the end that they should, as long as they are obedient, be protected thereby. The punishment of the innocent is a rendering of evil for good. In other words, inflicting harm on the innocent violates that social contract that was set up when the sovereign received his power from people. And thirdly, the law that commandeth equity, that is to say, an equal distribution of justice, which in punishing the innocent is not observed. The problem with equity here is that for Thomas Hobbes, the sovereign defines what equity is. In fact, for Hobbes, the sovereign defines what divine law is. Whereas for Baudin, a century before, he had a somewhat less absolute notion of the ruler's sovereignty, in saying that no, the human ruler does not get to decide what God's law is, particularly in how it applies to him. So we see with Hobbes, sort of from the 15th century, 16th century, sort of an opening up in terms of the absolutism of sovereignty. And maybe that's because the 16th century was so violent, particularly in England. Here he says also, in terms of this regard, Thomas Hobbes, he says it follows that where one is sovereign, another supreme. He's referring to one being the king and one the pope. Where one can make laws, another make canons, canon law, church law, there must needs be two commonwealths of one and the same subjects, which is a kingdom divided in itself. You probably heard that before, and cannot stand. For notwithstanding the insignificant distinction of temporal, that means time, and ghostly, meaning spirits, or souls, they are two kingdoms, and every subject is a subject to two masters. Now it's interesting he says two masters, because in the New Testament Bible it says that Jesus saying no one can serve two masters, and I think that's what Hobbes is getting at there. So he concludes, Hobbes that is, that the sovereign ruler has to be chief both in terms of religion and just interpreting what religion is, essentially interpreting theology, interpreting and legislating the canon law, and interpreting scripture and theology, and then also having the temporal powers in terms of essentially being king. Notice this also applies to an assembly, so it could be an assembly as well. It could be an elected assembly. So the question, I guess, both in regards to what's going on in Syria and Putin's invasion of a sovereign country, is can we afford the Baudin and Hobbes notion of absolute sovereignty? Add in the problems of global warming or climate change, in which 2040, 2050, we could begin to see the equilibrium of the world's climate, such that we move away from any sort of balance that could sustain our species. So we could, say, in curbing fossil fuels, we could, human nature, contain the seed of our own destruction. And part of that seed might be holding on to a concept such as the absolute sovereignty of sovereignty, and therefore precluding any sort of, at the global level, self-constraint or self-regulation that could perpetuate the species. So, in short, it really is very timely, this question of whether national sovereignty, sovereignty itself, is absolute or constrained. When the Russian government begins to violate that notion of absolute sovereignty and invading another country, I wonder if any sort of future vetoes of proposals to constrain the abuses, the punishment of innocence in other countries, will, at the UN Security Council, strike us as a bit not only hypocritical, but also really sort of show that the defense of absolute sovereignty by Russia and China is without much foundation. And that's really, I think, the significance of the current events at the time that I'm speaking now have and can hopefully result in some development in the political sphere in terms of institutions, such that our own nature does not contain a seed of our own species' self-destruction. Thank you.